My name is Harlow Robinson. I am a professor at Northeastern University, and I've written a lot about Russian and Soviet music, particularly about Prokofiev. Actually, I've written 2 books on Prokofiev, a biography of Prokofiev, and I also translated his letters in a collection. And I've been going to the Soviet Union and Russia for about, 30, 40 years now. And so Russian music is obviously a big interest of mine. And I also have done a lot of lectures for the Boston Symphony for, I think more than 10 years now. And I write quite a few program notes for the BSO as well, mainly on Russian and Slavic repertoire. Well, Prokofiev, his life divides really into 3 periods pretty neatly. He was born in 1891 in Russia, Tsarist Russia. He studied at St. Petersburg Conservatory, a period when the conservatory was having a very brilliant phase with lots of wonderful professors like Rimsky-Korsakov and Glazunov, and it was a very exciting period in Russian culture just before World War I. He lived in Russia until 1918, and then decided he had to leave because of the turmoil after the Russian Revolution. And he made this epic journey all the way across Siberia by the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Actually, he took the last train that made it all the way across Siberia. And he went to Japan, then by ship to Hawaii, and he landed in San Francisco. So then he ended up coming to the East Coast of America, New York, and he was based in America for a while in the early 20s. He lived in New York. He often came to Boston, actually. And particularly he came to Boston frequently after Sergei Prokofiev became the music director of the Boston Symphony in 1924, because he and Prokofiev had been friends back in Russia. And Prokofiev did a lot to promote Prokofiev's career in Europe and in America. So Prokofiev was based in America, but then started going increasingly to Europe and moved there to live in the mid-1920s in Paris. And he started going back to the Soviet Union. He made a visit there in 1927 and was greeted as this great returning musical hero, and actually got the kind of reception that he wasn't really getting in Europe, where his music was regarded not all that enthusiastically, especially since he was in direct competition with Stravinsky, which was a difficult issue for him really his whole life. So he was so excited about what he might do in Russia musically that he actually moved back there in 1936, brought his family with him, his 2 sons and his wife. So the last part of his life was lived in Soviet Russia from 1936 until he died the same day as Stalin, which is the last very strange irony of his career. He died March 5th, 1953, the same day as Stalin. And in fact, people didn't even know that he had died because he was so overwhelmed by the news of the death of Stalin. When Prokofiev went back to live in the Soviet Union in 1936, he was at that time regarded as the most important Russian composer. That situation changed, however, fairly soon after he returned. For one thing, it was just about when this very bad period of purges began, that is under Stalin, when he started to persecute lots of different figures in the arts and literature, cultural and intellectual life. There were these trials where various cultural figures were accused of espionage or deviant thinking and ended up in prison or even executed. So it was actually just after he returned to Russia, the atmosphere there became much more difficult for artists. And the second thing that happened is another composer emerged, Dmitri Shostakovich. And in fact, 1936 was the year of his great symphony, number 5, which made him really the leading Russian Soviet composer. So right at the moment that Prokofiev returned, he was confronted with this new star on the horizon, who did, in fact, over the years, rather eclipse Prokofiev. So first of all, in the West, it was Stravinsky, and then he comes back to Russia, and it's Shostakovich. Prokofiev also, when you look at his symphony and his career as a symphonist, it's quite fascinating. Because he grew up in a period in Russia when the symphony was really going out of style. and and in the West as well, of course. And he was very much associated as a young composer around World War I and in the years right after that with the avant-garde. And actually, he made his name through ballet early on. He met Sergei Diaghilev, who was another Russian who emigrated to Paris, created this great ballet company, the Ballet Russe. And so Prokofiev wrote for the Ballet Russe a number of scores right around World War I and just afterward. And that's really how people came to know him in the West, was mainly through his theatrical music and his piano music. He was a brilliant pianist, and he wrote a number of sonatas and many incidental pieces and several piano concerti. And that's really what made his reputation, not his symphonies. And in fact, the first symphony he wrote was the Classical Symphony, 1917. And that symphony, which now is very, very popular, almost maybe the most popular piece that Prokofiev wrote. We hear it on the radio all the time and everywhere else. But actually, that symphony was not very well known for quite a while. In fact, the premiere went almost unnoticed because it was right during the Great Revolutionary period in Russia, 1917, 1918. No one really paid much attention. But really, as a composer of symphonies, Prokofiev didn't really find his way until somewhat later. The Fourth Symphony, for example, that was actually written on music for a ballet that was originally composed for a ballet. It was the music for the ballet Prodigal Son, which was done in Paris for Diaghilev in the late 1920s. So the Fourth Symphony was a special commission for the Boston Symphony on its 50th anniversary for Koussevitzky, and Koussevitzky conducted the premiere in Boston. Although Koussevitzky wasn't all that happy that the symphony recycled music that had already been written for a ballet, and he told Prokofiev that he was somewhat disappointed. But it's a very successful piece, I think, although Prokofiev did revise it later. In fact, he revised the Fourth Symphony almost simultaneously with writing the Sixth Symphony in the mid-1940s. So the Fourth Symphony was done in Boston in the early 30s. And then actually there was quite a long period where Prokofiev didn't write any symphonies, all the way through the 1930s and actually until the end of World War II. Then he wrote his great Symphony No. 5, which is this epic work, which was very much perceived as a symphony about the Soviet victory over Nazism. And it had a very dramatic premiere in early 1945. Supposedly, the story goes that Prokofiev was conducting and he was just about to start, and there was this cannon salvo, a salvo of cannons firing, and it was celebrating the Red Army having crossed the Vistula in Poland towards Berlin.